It's a pleasure to be back at EDULEARN. I was here 4 years ago when the conference was held in Barcelona. How many of you were there then? Okay. I'm not repeating what I said 4 years ago. In fact, I'm talking about something totally different today. I'm talking about something that actually follows up on what I said 4 years ago. Now, many of you were not there 4 years ago, so don't panic, because there'll be a workshop later on where I will go through my talk on peer instruction, which is what I did 4 years ago in Barcelona. 4 years ago, the key point that I made was this: lectures, as illustrated on the screen behind me, focus on the transmission of information. This is actually a very outdated model that dates back all the way to the Middle Ages. And in fact, this picture, which is a picture of me teaching at Harvard many years ago when I was still an assistant professor, it's actually a very old picture. It was taken BC, before computers. You can see I'm using an overhead projector. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. In that talk 4 years ago, I contrasted the old model of teaching, where the first exposure to new material took place in the classroom, and then students go home and in their own rooms try to make sense of that information. That old model is replaced by one where the teacher helps the students with the hardest part of these two steps. I think if you think about it, the easy part, if you think of education as a two-step process as illustrated there, is the first one. And it's kind of ironic that as instructors, we're putting all our time in the easy step of education and leave the harder step to our students. So I presented a model there whereby we give students the responsibility for the easy step, namely the first exposure to the material, so that in class we can help them build a deeper understanding of the material. And I presented an approach called peer instruction, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'll present again in the workshop later today. That is not the focus of this talk. The focus of this talk is the bottom left part. How do you make sure that students actually do take that responsibility of, the first exposure to the material? In other words, if we are not lecturing, then how do we effectively transmit information outside of the classroom? Now, when I first contemplated that many, many years ago, in the early 1990s, my first impulse was to use video. I had already recorded all of my lectures. In those days, that was on VHS tapes, which were stored in the library. And I was thinking, maybe what I should do is just have my students watch my lecture before they come to class. After all, why reenact a lecture again if you've already given it before? However, video has a lot of drawbacks. The first one is that the transfer pace is set by the video, and it inherits a problem straight out of the lecture. You see, when you're listening to somebody lecture, your brain is held captive by the speaker. What do I mean by that? Well, our brains are not made to multitask. We cannot listen and think about something else at the same time. So if you're in a class, chemistry, physics, whatever, humanities, and you're wondering about something, your mind wanders, and you're no longer listening to the incoming stream of words. We can't think in a cognitively meaningful way about material and listen at the same time. Have you ever had in your class a student raise his or her hand and say, "Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think." It's never happened in my career, but you have to admit That's the only way to make space or time to think cognitively. Instead, what we do is we scribble down a note and tell ourselves we'll think about it later. However, most students rarely get to that second step. Now, in principle, video allows you to shut up the speaker for a few minutes by pausing it. I'm part of the edX consortium. I'm on the committee of HarvardX, actually, which is part of edX. And I've seen the data, and it turns out students do the opposite with video. They put the playback speed at 1.5 or 2.0 in order to get through it as fast as possible. So if anything, there's even less time to think in a cognitively meaningful way. The second thing is, as a viewer, when you are sitting in front of a person talking on the screen, you turn into a passive being, very much like sitting in an auditorium like this, listening to somebody speak. Thirdly, it turns out, from looking at the data again, that the viewing, the attention, drops precipitously as time passes. For the first class in the semester, the students watch the entire 20-minute video, but very quickly they discover that the way that they're held accountable for their viewing is not that difficult to cheat. In other words, they just jump forward to the multiple choice questions, then Google the answers, and pretend to have watched the video, whereas in reality they haven't watched anything. So towards the end of the semester, very few students are still actually watching the video. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it's an isolated, individual experience. You, the student, and the video. Whereas deep down, learning is a social experience. It doesn't take place in a vacuum. So all that we're doing by having students watch video is moving this out of the classroom so that we conveniently don't see it, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. So when I realized that, I thought, okay, let's have students read. Interestingly, Antonio Garcia showed a cartoon in his presentation about graduating not ending, about learning not ending at graduation, that showed an evolution of a person, and it showed reading throughout. It was reading, 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 reading. It's such an important skill. So I thought, let's read, because reading has an advantage. When you read a book, you are in control of the transfer pace. If your mind starts wandering, you might read another few words, but then you automatically stop because very quickly you realize that you're reading without thinking. You are in control of the transfer pace. Also, research has shown that the brain is much more active during reading than during watching. And developing good critical reading skills is probably one of the most important skills because it permits people to continue to sharpen knowledge and skills. However, how do I know that my students will do the reading if I tell them read chapter 22? There's no real accountability. And perhaps even more importantly, it's still an isolated individual experience, the student and the book. What do we want? Well, if you are to flip your classroom, as I proposed 4 years ago, and use the time with the learners in an activity that engages them, then you want every student prepared for every class, not just the first class at the beginning of the semester, but the second, the third, the fourth, all the way until the end of the semester. And I don't know about you, but ideally, you'd like to do that without having to put in additional effort. We're already quite busy anyway. Finally, a few years ago, it hit me. Turn the out-of-class component also into a social interaction. I don't know if you remember, but 4 years ago, I hammered onto making the classroom an interactive social experience. I don't know why it took me so long to come up with this idea of making the out-of-class component also into a social interaction. I'd like to present to you a platform which is actually free to use, Perusal, the URL is perusal.com, with which we can guarantee every student prepared for every class. Now, those of you who followed my career know that I love technology, but I'm a big skeptic when it comes to technology in education. Because most uses of technology in education are simply old wine into new bottles. And trust me, the wine doesn't taste any better in a new bottle. It's simply doing an old thing in a new way and hoping that that will suddenly change the experience. And in fact, if you evaluate uses of education technology, most of them fall into that category, and most of them do not actually improve the learning. So even though I'm a skeptic, I am presenting to you a technological solution now, but I think it makes something possible that was not possible before. At its heart, Perusal is a social learning platform. Students log in through their preferred social network, or by making an account if they're concerned about privacy, or through their LMS, Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, whichever. And once you're online, it looks like an e-reader. But it's not an ordinary e-reader. The first thing that you will notice is that at the top left, you can see who else in your class is online at the time. It takes the avatar from one of the social networks if you've connected it, and if you hover or otherwise it shows initials, and if you hover your cursor over that avatar, you can see the person's name. As you read the text, if there's something that makes you wonder, you can highlight that text. And as you highlight that text, it opens a chat window that is not very different from the chat window on your smartphone or Facebook or any other chat program. And as you type something in that chat window and hit return, the highlight sticks, and other students in the class can see that highlight too. So after a while, the page will be marked up with highlights. And if you click on one of these highlights, it opens up the transcript of the chat attached to that particular passage. So in this particular instance, let me blow this up. It's probably still too small for you to read, but it's irrelevant anyway, because it's about a physics textbook here. At midnight, a little bit past midnight, on October 20th, one student says, "I don't understand how this combination of factors, blah, blah, blah," and so on. 30 minutes later, another student says, "I think you may be able to think about the direction separately, blah, blah, blah." 2 days later, a third student says, "This is a great question. To further elaborate on this, we can blah, blah, blah," and so on. In a sense, you see here an asynchronous interaction between students online. In essence, not very different from what I described in the classroom. It's an asynchronous version of peer instruction online in preparation of the class. There are many features that I would love to show you, but I have no time. Maybe we can get to that later in the question and answer session. The big question is this: how do you get students to participate and take this seriously? Now, I'm an idealist, and I'd love to have students be intrinsically motivated to learn. I think it's so important that we keep students intrinsically motivated to learn. Unfortunately, education does a really good job robbing students of their ownership of learning and replacing intrinsic desire to learn, the intrinsic desire to learn that we're all born with, and replace it with an extrinsic reason to learn. I know, however, that by the time I get my students in my classroom, they're no longer that intrinsically motivated. So in order to get students to take this seriously, we use a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation drivers. And I'm going to begin by the extrinsic motivation driver. We have a rubric-based assessment, and if you want to use perusal when you come back to your institution and apply this in your class, you can download the rubric on the perusal website. And essentially what the rubric states is that the students, in the body of their annotation, must demonstrate thoughtful reading and interpretation of the text. So if all you do is highlight text and then write, I don't understand this, I don't understand this, I don't understand this, you get no credit at all because you can do that without reading anything. If you make highlights and you say, I don't understand this because on page 256 it says blah, 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 you get partial credit. If you highlight things and you say, I don't understand this because on page 256 it says blah, 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 and I thought that, and you reveal your thought process, you get full credit. We want a minimum number of those thoughtful comments. It doesn't matter if you put thoughtless comments because we want students to engage in chat, so that's quite all right, as long as they have a certain minimum number of thoughtful annotations, less if they're very thoughtful, more if they're less thoughtful. We want them to be on time before class starts. Interestingly, it turns out that most students, we have about 200,000 students on the platform now from across the world in many different countries. And just looking at the data, what we find is that a lot of students continue to use it after the deadline, showing that to them it's intrinsically important too for their learning. And lastly, we want them to be distributed. This is something we added in class testing because we found early on that if you don't have that requirement, the students will annotate the first 2 pages of a 10-page reading assignment and then say, I'm done. So now they need to be not clustered, but distributed. With a simple rubric, which, as I said, you can download, in my class, where I have 60 students, I get in one semester 20,000 annotations. 20,000 annotations. Pause at that for a moment. This means that the students write more text than the author of the textbook that they're reading. So I can already hear you think, how do you process all of that? Didn't you tell me no more work? Well, I wouldn't be standing here and talking about it if I didn't have a solution for it. The assessment is fully automated. I got together with a colleague of mine who is a quantitative social scientist and who's built a career out of doing quantitative analysis of posts on social media, in particular Twitter, China Weibo, WeChat, and so on. And it turns out that you can easily adapt that algorithm for this context. So we wrote a specialized machine learning algorithm that actually assesses intellectual content. And we showed, this is an article that was recently published, that on large number of annotations, as we have, the machine easily exceeds intercoder reliability. So if you take 2 humans, they will not agree 100%. In fact, they will not agree much more than 75% because the rubric is partially subjective. One person may think this is thoughtful, another may not think a certain annotation is thoughtful. However, if you train the machine with the annotation evaluation of one person and then continue to have the machine track that person, you get around 80% agreement. So on large number, it far exceeds what the human brain is capable of, and it can process a lot of information much faster and with much more patience than a human being can. So immediately after the assignment is over, you have a grade book where you can see in great detail the performance of the students. How many total number of annotations for a given assignment, how many were made on time, how thoughtful they were, how distributed they were, and so on. But it gets so much better than this. You see, I was using the manuscript for my own textbook initially when we developed this. And so I was really curious about the annotations that the students made because this was an opportunity for me to find out how the students were thinking about what I wrote rather than other reviewers, who are other instructors, who look at it very differently. And in a sense, these annotations were like a window into the brains of my students. I'd go, wow. I thought this was the clearest paragraph I ever wrote in my whole life, only to find out that the students are totally confused by it because they interpret a word differently from the way you have intended it. Also, I realized that this was the perfect complement to peer instruction, because now I could match the classroom activity to the pre-class assignment. The questions that the students had were the perfect questions to seed a discussion in the classroom. In other words, I would not be using my questions, I'd use the students' questions. But you see, 20,000 annotations per semester, that's still about 1,000 per class, and that's a lot of clicking and reading. So we developed another little algorithm where with one click of your mouse, you can generate a confusion report. Here's a confusion report from a class at the University of Central Florida. This was a physics class too. And the confusion reports gives you the 3 main topics of confusion. I don't know if you can read it, but at the top it says the RightHand Rule. This was obviously a chapter about magnetism. The direction of the magnetic field, second topic of confusion, and the Earth's magnetic field. And for each of these 3 topics, it shows 3 exemplar questions. For example, in the middle, direction of the magnetic field, the first question, why is it that the magnetic field points away from the North Pole and towards the South Pole, when on the previous page it stated the direction of the magnetic field is the direction that the North Pole of a compass needle points? It's a very good question. And the question results from the fact that what we call the North Pole of the Earth is actually a magnetic South Pole. And the textbook that they were using at the University of Florida, Central Florida, did not explain that fact. Now imagine you're a teacher and you're not aware, you know that the North Pole is a magnetic South Pole, but you're not aware, because of your own knowledge, the curse of knowledge, as my colleague Steven Pinker likes to call it, you're not aware that the book doesn't mention that. Students are confused. You don't know why they're confused. This actually permits you to find out. So before I teach my class, I look at the confusion report. I make a slide that has the 3 topics, so right-hand rule, direction of magnetic field, Earth's magnetic field. And I walk into the classroom and I said, thank you for all your thoughtful annotation. It turns out that there are 3 main topics of confusion, topic 1, topic 2, topic 3. One of you asked the following question yesterday. Why is it, cut and paste, essentially? And the students go, wow, he actually read all our annotations. Yeah, I read 9 of them, but they don't need to know that. So what are the motivating factors? Well, the intrinsic one, it's a social interaction. I didn't get to show you that, but students get actually to interact with each other online, sometimes asynchronously, sometimes synchronously. There's a tie-in to the in-class activity, because now if they do the reading and they take the effort to communicate to you as a teacher what is difficult or confusing, there's a good chance either somebody else will address it, or if it remains unanswered, the instructor might address it the next day in class. And lastly, there's, of course, the extrinsic motivation, which is the assessment, the stick, if you want, the punishment, which I don't like, but you can turn it off if you want, which is fully automated. Let me show you some results. These data are actually from my own class at Harvard, but we recently analyzed data at Ohio State and some other large schools, and they're no different. On the horizontal, you see the number of chapters that the students missed throughout the term. That graph continues to far outside this auditorium, because the students had to read 17 chapters, not just 6. But all the other data is 0, which is why I'm not showing it. It shows it for 3 different semesters as we were fine-tuning the algorithm. The dark one is the most recent one. And as you can see, 70% of the students misses 0 chapters. They annotate every single chapter thoughtfully. 70%, every single one. That's pretty impressive. I don't know about you, but I sometimes miss deadlines simply because, you know, there are too many things to do. I'm sure that some students will miss deadlines because they're sick, they have an exam in another course, whatever. As you can see, the last year, the black data there is not a single student who misses more than 4 chapters. There's actually 1 student who misses 4 chapters, and a handful, maybe 8 or 9 or so, who misses 2. If you put together these first 3 columns, you add them up together, you get to 95%. I think this is as close as you can get. Even putting pointing a gun at somebody's head will not get the person to do more, to get every student prepared for every class. So there are much more data, but unfortunately I don't have time to show that. 81% of the students spend 2 to 6 hours per week reading, and 40% actually takes note while reading. Almost all of them annotate as they read. A large study done at Ohio State in a 750 student chemistry class, introductory chemistry class, showed that students who use perusal score significantly higher on the assessment that they're using in those classes. So what are the benefits to you as an instructor? Well, one is virtually 100% completion of assignments and improved use of classroom time. Rather than regurgitating information which is ready available, you can focus there where your students need you the most because it becomes visible rather than shoved under the rug. And for the students, it is a huge benefit because they engage in a skill, in developing a skill that will be crucial throughout their entire career. So if you want to use perusal, let me explain to you how to do that. You essentially register as an instructor at perusal.com and create a course. Then you upload whichever PDF files you want. If it's something you own the copyright to, you can do it without any problem. If it's from a copyrighted source, you need to arrange that with a copyright holder. If you want to use a commercial textbook, you can choose a textbook from the catalog that we have. If it's not among the, I think close to 100,000 books that we have online, let us know and we'll try to get the textbook online for you. And then the only other thing you have to do is provide the students with your course access code, which you will get when you create the code, and it's done. Essentially, the students have immediate access to the information and can start annotating. So you see how the message I'm giving you today complements what I told you 4 years ago, and I'm reproducing the slides which I had at the end of my keynote 4 years ago. I said, education is not just the transfer of information. It's not, like Susanna said, listen, memorize, and regurgitate. It's so much more than that. It's so much more than getting the students to do what we do. We want to equip our students with the skills necessary to solve the problems of the 21st century. Privacy, security, health, energy, water resources. If all we do is teach by example, then the best the students can do is solve the problems that we can solve. Well, there are many problems that we don't know how to solve, and we need the next generation to be able to solve that. And I stated 4 years ago that an active engagement, a social interaction, is a must in the classroom. I've shown you today how we can extend that idea to online and out of the classroom. Thank you very much.